Welcome to the Captain's Ready Room, The Lost Logs. The first really successful Star Trek campaign I ever ran was Last Voyage of the Rutan. And what made the biggest difference here was that I actually found a copy to buy of the last Unicorn version of the Star Trek rules, the Star Trek The Next Generation role-playing game. It's a great book, very well laid out, lots of good advice. The rules are not the best rules I've ever seen for any role-playing game ever. They're a little bit flattened and simplistic in some ways, but they work. There's nothing too awful about the rules. And the book itself is well written. It's very useful for a GM. It explains to you how to run a game, how to make it a Star Trek game, how to capture the tone. It's probably the best of the Star Trek GMing books I've ever read, of all the different systems, in the sense that it sort of teaches you about storytelling and specifically how to make a Star Trek type of story, particularly in the Next Generation style. I also later got a copy of the original series version of it, just called the Star Trek role-playing game, I believe. And that's useful if you want that era. But yeah, it's more or less the same advice. Slightly reorganized, some things a little bit more sensibly organized. But yeah, they clearly put a lot of thought into the structure of the book before writing it out. But anyway, once I had this book, I was quite inspired to start a full campaign finally. And in June of 2005, I've organized the first campaign I ever put together with players I'd never met before. I went onto a local role-playing forum and advertised saying, who wants to come join a Star Trek game? And I got a couple new players who we hadn't played with before and who kind of stuck around with us for quite a few years after. And we even met a few other people through them. And you could say it was a success in that way. No longer in touch with them, haven't played with them in years, but at the time it was good enough for the start of the campaign. I had also been, since the previous year, thinking through a bit more about what I wanted in a Star Trek game and how I could actually run games that I would find interesting and that hopefully others would find interesting as well. I think the failure of the Starfleet Academy campaign gave me a lot to think about, especially. And over the 6 months since that had flopped, I got a lot of time to rethink how I could run the game. So we got the game together, and the very first adventure, or episode rather, was titled Flora and Fauna. And this is one that you can download on my blog. I've got the latest version of the adventure adapted to the Modifius rules. Back then we were obviously using the Last Unicorn rules, and in fact that was actually my second time running the adventure, because I had originally written this thing for Advanced Dungeons & Dragons 2nd edition as a Planescape setting adventure. And I think it was, probably you could argue still is, a pretty decent adventure. Certainly it was good for me to get started with. It was a nice clear concept, but it looks a bit weird and strange, so it keeps the players on their toes. And there's a lot of room for variation in it. The GM doesn't have to force a railroad. You can just set up the scenario and see what the players do. So yeah, it was a good start. After that was another adventure pre-written by the name of something, Perdition's Flames. Perdition's Flames is an interesting one. It's written for the Next Generation era, but it references events from the original series. And I, at the time, had basically not watched any of the original series, so I didn't really get the reference directly, but you know, it was well written and easy to follow, and the plot of it makes good sense. Um, and it really excited the players because it was not at all what they expected. It was very different from most conventional next generation type stories. And it was also very different from Flora and Fauna. So the first two episodes took them in two very different directions. Um, and I think that was quite compelling to the players, and I enjoyed it quite a lot as well. Um, After that, um, the next half dozen episodes were all based in the same region that Perdition's Flames is supposed to be set in, which is the Cerberus group of stars. I think the nebula, or the group of nebulas it's in, is called the Styx Rift. And in Perdition's Flames, that's not really a big deal. It's just, you know, a bunch of space that their one particular world happens to be located in. But I took that as my starting point to build up a whole campaign. I said, all right, well, the reason you're going there and accidentally finding the plot of Perdition's Flames is that your little tiny Oberth-class science vessel is going to do some detailed charting of the Styx Rift. And that gave me a nice, clear, easy setup for my very first successful run of a campaign, much simpler than the Starfleet Academy thing where there had to be a reason that people had to care about being in Starfleet Academy, and I had to make the Academy something more interesting than just a school. The Styx Rift was already interesting enough, right? There's a reason Starfleet is there. It's to go and chart the thing, to figure out what's inside of this mess of nebula. The players had reason to be interested in it because they're presumably playing Star Trek because they want to go explore space. And here's some space to go and explore. Right? What they find in it, well, that doesn't have to be predestined. There's nothing specific about the setup of the campaign that forces them to go one way or another, or to expect certain things in it. And so I could run a fairly episodic campaign. Each episode didn't really have anything to do with the previous one. But all tied together by the concept of mapping out the Styx Rift. And that worked really well, and I think everybody was very happy with those first 5 or 6 episodes. The other episodes, I think there was the first one that I'd made up, not exactly improvised the way I would these days, where I just run it completely on the fly, but there was one where I couldn't run the adventure I'd prepared because half the players called in absent. So I needed to suddenly come up with something that would be suitable for only 1 or 2 players. I think it turned out to be 3 players in the end, but a smaller number than was expected. And that wouldn't have significant impacts on what I had already got planned for later episodes. And that little side quest adventure was also very important to me because it was the first time I really got involved with Orion and Nausicaan NPCs. And Orions and Nausicans have been really useful to me over the years. Maybe I cliche them a little bit, but I've done interesting things with them, I think. And this episode, by the title of Any Port in a Storm, that worked out really well. And I think the Orions and Nausicans, because I had a nice clear idea in my head of what I wanted them to be like, I could improvise around them. So, useful lesson there. Then the other episodes, nothing too exciting until we get out the Styx Rift. Okay? And this is now, where are we, about September? Yeah, September of 2005. I knew the end of the Styx Rift part of the adventure was coming to a close because I specified there was a finite number of stars in there to look at. And I was trying to figure out what to do next, and reading through the rule book, the GM's history section, it became clear to me that we were set in the early 2360s in what must have been the middle of the Federation-Cardassian War. I thought, well, that's a major prominent point in history. I must go stick my players into that because that's what's currently going on, and it'll be weird if they avoid that, which was a mistake. They're a little tiny science ship. Oberth class doesn't really have any place in a big battle region. The rest of Starfleet mostly ignored it as well, as we know from the first, 5 or 6 seasons of Next Generation. We don't get to see anything of the Cardassians until they had finally decided that they were going to make Deep Space Nine. And so the Cardassian War can pretty easily be justified as this thing going off in the background that only a small fraction of Starfleet is involved in, and the rest of the Starfleet are involved in more routine matters with, Klingons and Romulans and space and the final frontier. So I could have just ignored it, but it was a learning experience. I took a stab at it, and threw in this little USS Rutan as a scout, I think I called it, as something to do observations, but not really get involved in fighting. And I had a much less clear idea of what I wanted to do with the adventures for that part. There was a lot more that I borrowed from pre-written adventures, also borrowed from completely different genres. I think my original success with taking flora and fauna from D&D kind of tricked me into thinking that I could take other fantasy adventures and just Star Trekify them, and that often didn't work out very nicely. I think there were a lot of adventures where I didn't have a nice, clear idea of what I wanted them to be, and I didn't prepare them as well as I should. I guess I was getting busier and busier. And so that half of the campaign just kind of didn't go anywhere too exciting. I don't remember anything particularly awful, just nothing especially great. And then, as a series closer, right at the end, decided to do a mirror universe episode, which was the first time I'd ever tried that. I think the episode was titled Dream of Mirrors, which was an Iron Maiden reference. I was into Iron Maiden at the time, less so these days, but that's where I got the name from, so it's convenient. And I told the players in advance, you're going to be in the mirror universe. So you're going to make mirror versions of your characters. Please think about how do you mirror your character. And I'm not sure that they all really got it exactly. This was not too much longer after we'd all seen the Enterprise Mirror Universe two-parter, which sort of brought the Mirror Universe back to life for the Star Trek franchise. And I think a lot of people maybe got the wrong impression from that of how to play that sort of character. When I wrote the adventure, I sort of expected it to be very political, very backstabby, very sneaky and underhanded. And I got a lift to the place where we were playing with one of the players, and the whole way there she was explaining to me what her character had in mind, how she would overthrow the captain, very elaborate, long, complicated plan. And when we actually got there, in the first minute of play, one of the other characters just immediately killed her. Took her phaser, shot her on the bridge in front of everyone, putting the whole game into chaos. And it really wasn't at all sneaky or underhanded. It was overhanded, very overhanded. So yeah, that was a weird one, but I think it was fun enough in its own way. And then the following year, we switched over for about 6 months or so to a sort of a sequel campaign, which I'll cover in the next video, called Quantum Anomalies. But when Quantum Anomalies ended, I somehow got it in my head that I wanted to go back to the USS Rutan and do a season 2, or at least a special episode for Last Voyage of the Rutan, and also had it in my head in the time that I wanted to try LARPing. Never LARPed before that. Never LARPed since that either. It was not the worst episode ever. It was okay. But it was very clunky and uncomfortable, and nobody was really sure what was going on. One of the obvious big problems with Star Trek role-playing is that your characters are supposed to be experts on super science, right? Amazing technology and concepts that don't exist in real modern science. So even though I had some actual science graduates among my players, you can't expect them to play their characters to that same level. And that was a little bit uncomfortable. It basically meant that I spent my whole time as GM running around, physically running around from place to place, trying to get people to figure out what their characters could possibly know. And it went okay. The story concluded, it was fine. Yeah, so that was Last Voyage of the Rutan. Which, as it ends up being, was not actually the last voyage of the Rutan, but we'll get to that in another video. And I think it was a pretty good start for me in Star Trek role-playing. 2004, as I said, there was a couple, once-offs and the failed Starfleet Academy campaign that gave me an introduction to what was possible. Last Voyage of the Rutan was the one that actually really got me started on regularly GMing Star Trek. I think I was lucky to have players who were willing to put up with my inexperience. I think that's probably the nicest way of saying it. But I got to learn from my mistakes, and I got into some pretty decent habits. Luckily, I still have a lot of very good records written from back then, so I can still refer to the same lessons from back then as well. And that's kind of what these videos are becoming now. It's just me trying to express to the world things that I've learned from running Star Trek that maybe are useful to other Star Trek GMs. Main lesson from Last Voyage of the Rutan, I would say, would be give it a go, give it a try. Bring in people you don't know. Try out new concepts that are different from what's currently working. Just because it's working doesn't mean it's going to work forever, or that other things can't work. Feel free to experiment and mess around and try stuff. There's nothing wrong with experimenting. And when it goes wrong, that's okay. You just figure out a different way of doing it.